Wyoming, 1882. Winter is coming, and Constance is the only thing standing between starvation and her young daughter. Abandoned by a husband too busy spending their last coins on cards, whiskey, and other women, she has to fend for herself and for 8-year-old Abby, alone. Until she goes to get firewood in the barn, until she finds, unconscious on her floor, a man on the run. 3 bullet wounds, no explanation. A pistol on the ground beside him. Turning him in would be the right thing to do. But then she sees the pups. 2 tiny wolves, curled against his chest like he's the only safe place in the world, clinging to him in a way that makes no sense. Constance stops, stares, and forgets, for one breathless moment, every reason she has to walk away. Because what is a wounded outlaw on the brink of death doing cuddling wolf pups? Chapter 1. The last of winter's snow retreated from the valley, leaving behind mud and broken promises. Constance looked out at the devastation before her. Half her newly planted wheat field washed away in last night's storm, now floating somewhere downstream, gone as surely as the money Duke had lost at the card tables. "Mama?" 6-year-old Abby tugged at her skirt. "Are the crops gone?" Constance swallowed the lump in her throat. "Not all of them, sweetheart." She forced a smile. "We'll manage. We always do." But managing was getting harder every season. Duke had been gone 2 weeks now. No letter, no word. Not that word would have changed anything. The farm they'd scraped together on the edge of nowhere was failing. Not because the land was bad, because one woman and a child couldn't do the work of 3, no matter how early Constance rose or how late she stayed up. She tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear and surveyed what remained of her life. A weathered cabin with a leaking roof, a rickety barn housing their only milk cow, and now half a field of ruined crops. "When's Papa coming home?" Abby asked, the way she always did, casually, carefully, with the practiced ease of a child who had learned not to expect too much. "Soon," Constance said vaguely. She didn't mention that Duke's brother, Sheriff Isaiah Fletcher, had stopped by last week while she was in town. Isaiah had that look he always wore around her, half pity, half disapproval, and he'd let it slip, too casually, that Duke owed someone in town a considerable sum. A man's got to pay his debts, Constance. The implication had hung in the air like smoke. Isaiah would collect, one way or another. He was the sheriff, after all. "Let's get inside before it rains again," she told Abby, glancing at the darkening sky. The first fat drops hit them as they reached the porch. Thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the cabin's foundation. "Abby, stay in the cabin for a bit," Constance said. "I need to fetch firewood." "Can I come?" "Not this time. Make yourself some porridge, the good kind with the honey. I'll be back before it's cold." Constance pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and crossed the yard toward the barn. The door was shut but not latched. She frowned. She always latched it. Every night, without fail, without exception. Carefully, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The milk cow shifted in her stall, tossing her head. Morning light fell in thin, gray slats through the gaps between the weathered planks. The haystack, the old saddle Duke never used, the stack of firewood in the far corner, all exactly where she'd left them. Everything looked normal, except a sound, low and ragged, like someone trying to draw air through a wound. It came from the back of the barn, behind the haystack, where the shadows pooled thick and dark. Constance's heart struck once against her ribs. She hadn't brought the rifle. The sound came again, breathing, wet and labored. Constance thought of fencing a gun, of sending for Isaiah. She didn't. She took one step, then another. Her eyes adjusted to the dim, and the shadow in the corner took shape. It was a man, slumped against the back wall, half sitting, half fallen. Big, broad-shouldered, long-limbed, though he was curled in on himself now, knees drawn up, head dropped forward. Dark hair hung across his face in wet, tangled ropes, and beneath it she could just make out the sharp line of a jaw, the hard angle of a cheekbone. His shirt was torn open across the chest, and the blood. It soaked the fabric from collar to hem, dark and heavy, and beneath him it had spread across the packed dirt floor. A pistol lay just beyond his outstretched hand, not raised, fallen from fingers that had lost their grip. Constance stared at him. Why was he here? The question was sharp, insistent. If he was hurt this badly, and he was, badly, undeniably, why hadn't he gone to town? To the doctor? To anyone? Why had he come here, to a stranger's barn? He was hiding, she realized. There was no other explanation. She took another step closer. Close enough now to see that his chest was moving. Barely, shallowly, but moving. Alive, then. Then came a whimper. Small, thin, coming from somewhere near the man's body, muffled and trembling. Constance's gaze dropped, and her breath caught. Tucked against his side, half buried beneath the folds of his ruined shirt, were 2 wolves' pups. Barely bigger than rabbits, both of them, with light gray fur matted flat against their small bodies. One was curled beneath his arm, pressed so close its nose was buried against his ribs. The other was flattened against his chest, shivering, its tiny body rising and falling with each of his shallow breaths. They were whimpering, small, frightened sounds, the kind that came from something cold and scared and completely out of places to run. Constance's first thought was quick and sharp. They did this to him. Feral pups, teeth, and... But they were tiny, scrawny little things, trembling and soaked through with rain. There was no baring of teeth, no tucking of tails, no growl, no warning. Just 2 small creatures pressed against a bleeding man. Something in Constance's chest went soft and tight at the same time. She took one careful step forward. Both pups moved at once. Not away from her, into him. They scrambled, squirming, shoving at each other as they fought for space against the man's neck. One burrowed beneath his chin, flattening itself against the bloody collar of his shirt. The other shoved in beside it, let out a small, indignant huff when its brother crowded it and pressed its face into the crook of the man's neck. They looked, for a moment, absolutely ridiculous. 2 scrappy little creatures wrestling each other for the exact same patch of ruined shirt, hiding their heads while wiggling the rest of their bodies as though she wouldn't notice. Despite everything, the blood, the fear, the strangeness of it all, Constance felt the corner of her mouth twitch. She crouched, slowly, resting her arms on her knees. The smaller one, the one tucked against his chest, peered at her. Why does this man have wolf pups with him? She thought. They were pressed against him, clinging, tucked into every available inch of him, like they were trying to disappear into his body entirely. They belonged to him, Constance thought, and the moment she thought it, she couldn't unthink it. She looked back at the man, unconscious, bleeding, hiding in her barn with a pistol and 2 wolf pups who wouldn't let go of him, and felt the first, quiet stirring of a question she didn't yet have the words for. Chapter 2. Constance didn't move for a long time. She stayed crouched there in the half-light, watching the man breathe, shallow, uneven breaths, and tried to think clearly. Leave him. The thought was sensible, practical. She had a daughter in the cabin and a life that was already barely holding together. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to close the barn door. She looked at the blood on the floor, at the way his breathing kept stuttering, at the pups curled up against him. She couldn't do it. "All right," she said quietly to no one in particular. "All right." She moved quickly after that, grabbed an old horse blanket from the rail and spread it over a patch of clean straw in the stall furthest from the door. Then she knelt beside him and reached for his arms to drag him over. But she got nowhere. The pups wouldn't let go. Not aggressively. There was no snapping, no biting. But the moment her hands closed around his arm and she pulled, both of them dug in. The larger one pressed its whole body against his ribs, claws, tiny, soft little things, hooked into the fabric of his shirt. The smaller one crawled higher, wedging itself between his neck and his shoulder, and let out a thin, high whine that went straight through Constance's chest. She stopped pulling, sat back. "Hey," she said softly, softer than she usually spoke to anyone. "Don't be scared." The larger pup turned its head toward her, one dark eye, watching. Its little body was still shaking. Constance held very still. Then slowly she extended one hand, palm up, fingers loose, just there, just waiting. The pup sniffed, its small, cold nose brushed against her fingertips. A growl. Barely a growl, really. More of a vibration in its tiny chest, a warning that carried no real heat behind it. "I don't know you," it seemed to say. "I know," Constance murmured. "But I need to help him, and I can't do that with you both sitting right there." She kept her hand steady. The pup sniffed again. Then, after a long, considering pause, it pressed its head against her palm. Something in Constance's chest cracked open, just a little. The fur was softer than she expected, damp from the rain, but soft beneath, almost impossibly so. She curled her fingers gently, scratching behind the pup's ear, and felt its whole small body shiver. "There you are," she whispered. "See? It's all right." She moved her hand to the second pup, the smaller one, still pressed against the man's neck. This one was more frightened. It flinched when her fingers brushed its fur, let out another thin whine, and tried to burrow deeper into the crook of his throat. "Come now," Constance said, her voice low and steady. "You're soaking wet, both of you. You'll catch your death out here." She stroked down its back, slow and even. The pup turned its head, small and pointed and impossibly earnest, with blue eyes that seemed too bright, too aware, for something so small. Then, with a tiny, resigned sigh, it unclenched. Constance gathered them both up, one in each arm. The larger one tucked against her collarbone immediately. The smaller one watched her a moment longer before giving in and pressing close. She was settling them onto dry straw nearby when the barn door creaked. "Mama?" Abby stood in the doorway, soaked. "Abby, you're supposed to be inside." "Oh," she breathed. She crossed the barn in quiet steps. Her whole face lit up. The two of them regarded each other, the little girl with her wide, wondering eyes, and the small, dark wolf with its serious face. Then the pup pressed its nose against Abby's outstretched fingers. "Oh, you're so soft," Abby whispered. The second pup peered at her, ears perking forward. Abby held out her other hand. The smaller pup crawled forward and sniffed her palm. "They're so cute, Mama," she said, and looked up with an expression so purely happy that it made something ache behind Constance's ribs. "They might bite," Constance said. "They're wild, Abby." "They won't bite me." The smaller pup had gone boneless in Abby's lap, eyes drifting shut, a rumble vibrating through its body. The larger one was climbing her arm. "Can we keep them?" Abby asked. "Please?" Constance looked at her daughter, already curling around them, already in love, and felt the argument die in her throat. "We'll see," she said. "I'm going to feed them," Abby declared, and stood carefully, both pups cradled against her. "Abby, be careful!" But Abby was already heading for the door, moving as if she understood that these small creatures needed to be carried like something precious. "They wouldn't bite me," she said over her shoulder, one of the pups lifting its head to lick her chin. And then she was gone. And Constance was alone with the wounded man and the blood on the floor and the quiet. She took a breath, then another. Then she went back to work. She went to the cabin at a near run, paring knife, sharpened, water set to heat, clean cloth from the mending pile. Abby was at the table, both pups beside her. Constance didn't stop. She took what she needed and went back to the barn. Up close, the wounds were worse than she'd thought. 3 entry points across his chest and left side. Angry, dark holes in the torn fabric of his shirt, the skin swollen and hot, still seeping. 3 bullet wounds, and he was still breathing. She didn't have time to wonder how. She picked up the knife. The first bullet was close to the surface. She could feel it under her fingertips, round and hard and wrong beneath the skin. She worked it free and set it aside. The second was deeper. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from the effort of being precise when everything in her was screaming to be fast. She bit the inside of her cheek, held steady, and found it. The third was the worst. No glint of metal. She couldn't see it at all. She pressed in deeper than felt safe, and for a horrible few seconds there was nothing but the give of flesh and the hot slick of blood. Then, the unmistakable resistance of metal. She hooked the tip of the blade and pulled. The bullet came free with a wet, awful sound. Constance pressed both hands against the wound, holding the cloth tight. Her arms ached. Her fingers were slick with blood, and her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. And then, beneath her hands, she felt something. Warmth. Not fever. Not the dull, sick heat of a body-fighting infection. Something alive in a way she couldn't quite name. A deep, steady pulse that traveled up through her fingers, into her wrists, and for one strange, breathless moment, she felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her. She pulled her hands back, stared at them, blood red and trembling. Exhaustion, she told herself. The cold, the shock of it. She pressed the cloth back down and held it firm. He woke without warning. One moment he was still, slack and pale and barely there. The next his eyes flew open and Constance jerked back. His eyes were gold. Not brown, not amber, not any color she had ever seen in a human face. Bright, burning gold, like lamplight. They were unfocused, wild, and his body moved before his mind caught up. His hand reached out, grasping at the air. The word came out broken, barely a rasp. His fingers curled and uncurled against the straw. My kids. Where are... His head dropped back, eyes shut, gone again. She stayed where she was for a long moment, kneeling in the quiet of the barn. My kids. He'd said it like a prayer. She thought of the pups, the way they'd clung to him, whimpered when she moved them. They were wolves. Just wolves. Frightened creatures who'd stayed close to their wounded owner because that was what frightened creatures did. That was all. Constance finished wrapping his wounds and went back to the cabin. She found them on the floor by the hearth. The larger pup was sprawled on its back, all four paws in the air, batting at Abby's dangling hand. The smaller one had planted itself against Abby's shin, pushing insistently, letting out a series of small, indignant whines. Abby was laughing. They both want to be pet at the same time, she told Constance, breathless, scratching behind the larger pup's ears with one hand, while the smaller one tried to climb into her lap. Watch, every time I pay attention to one, the other one does this. The smaller pup, as if on cue, shoved the larger one sideways and wedged itself into the exact spot it had been occupying. The larger one righted itself, shook its fur out with an air of tremendous dignity, and tried again. Constance watched them for a moment. The two of them, jockeying and shoving and huffing at each other, each convinced that Abby belonged entirely to them. Fighting over her attention the way children fight over a new friend, Constance thought. Chapter 3. Morning came in gray and quiet, the storm finally spent. Constance found Abby on the floor again. Where else? With both pups sprawled across her lap in a tangle of dark fur and small, twitching limbs. One of them had its nose buried in the remains of Abby's breakfast, licking crumbs off the edge of her plate with a pink tongue so small it could barely reach. The other was on its back, all four paws in the air, letting Abby scratch its belly with an expression of such profound, drowsy contentment that Constance almost laughed. They slept with me, Abby said without looking up. Well, I slept with them. They were cold. Abby, Constance scored. I told you... They curled up against me, Mama. Abby finally looked up. They chose to. The belly pup chose that moment to sneeze, a tiny, violent little thing that made its whole body jolt and both of its eyes scrunch shut. Abby dissolved into giggles. Constance watched them for a moment longer than she meant to. The easy warmth of it. The way the pups had settled into Abby's world overnight like they'd always been part of it. Cute, she thought. But Duke would be back soon. A week, maybe less, and the pantry was nearly bare. She needed flour, salt, cornmeal. She needed to go to Clearwater. I'm going to town, she told Abby. For supplies. You'll stay here. Don't go near the man in the barn. Clearwater's main street was a sea of mud after the storm. Flour, salt, cornmeal. Maybe some dried beans if Constance could stretch the money. Mrs. Hatcher would give her credit, grudgingly, with that pinched expression and those disapproving little sighs. But she would give it. The store bell announced her. A handful of women clustered near the counter looked up. Constance ignored them. She gathered what she needed, paid what she could, and turned to leave, but, tacked to the board beside the door, Among the notices about missing livestock and church socials and the price of grain was a wanted poster. She almost walked past it, but something made her stop. The sketch was rough, but the face was unmistakable. The sharp jaw, the dark hair, the hard, angular lines of a man she'd seen only hours ago. Her stomach dropped. Wanted, Brooks Alston. $500 reward. Wanted for robbery, dead or alive. Brooks. She knew his name now. And she knew what he was. Or what the law said he was. A criminal. A fugitive. A man with a price on his head. And he was hiding in her barn. The ride home was short. The mood was shorter. By the time she reached the property, her jaw was set and her mind was made up. She'd tend to him one more time. She wasn't heartless, but she wasn't stupid either. And harboring a wanted man was the kind of thing that could bring Isaiah to her door, and Isaiah was the last person she needed asking questions about what came and went on this farm. She tied up the horse and walked to the barn, pushed the door open, and stopped. He was on the ground. Of course he was. He could barely sit up, let alone stand, propped against the back wall with his legs stretched out in front of him and his head tipped back. Both pups were with him. The larger one was curled against his side, tucked under his arm, its gray fur rising and falling with each breath he took. Completely at ease, the smaller one had claimed his chest, draped across it like a small scarf, and he was awake. One of the man's hand rested on the larger pup's back, fingers buried in fur, scratching slow, idle circles as he murmured something, barely above a whisper. Right there, son, I've got you." The smaller pup let out a sleepy little sigh and pressed deeper into his chest. The larger one rolled onto its back and pawed at his hand until he shifted his scratching to its belly. "Good," Brooks murmured, and there was something in his voice, something so quiet and so unguarded that made Constance's chest do an odd, lurching thing. "That's good. You're all right." He said it the way you said it to something very small that had been frightened. Constance stood in the doorway and forgot entirely what she'd come in here to say. The light from the door fell across him, across the man and the two small wolves draped over him like they were part of him, and something in her chest did a slow, quiet turn. "It's the pups," she told herself. "That's all. They're very small, and he's very gentle with them, and it was a sad picture. That was what it was. A wounded man and two frightened little things, all of them alone in the world, clinging to each other. The larger pup opened one eye, spotted her, and closed it again, apparently deciding she was not a threat worth investigating. The smaller one didn't stir at all. Constance let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and stepped inside. The man, Brooks, noticed her then. He looked at her. "Mrs.?" His voice was scratched raw. He swallowed and tried again. "I'm sorry. For the trouble." "Don't move," Constance said, more sharply than she intended. She set down the supplies she'd brought, water, fresh cloth, and knelt beside him, reaching for the edge of his bandage to check beneath it. He watched her hands, then her face, then with visible effort, pushed himself straighter against the wall. Both pups shifted, grumbling, adjusting to the movement. "We should go," he said. "You and your daughter. You don't need this. Me here." "You can barely sit up," Constance pointed out. "Don't worry, I heal fast." She looked at him. At the gray tinge still underneath his skin, at the way his jaw had tightened against the pain of moving. "You have 3 bullet wounds," she said flatly. "You've been unconscious for most of 2 days." Something flickered in his expression. Pride, she thought. The stubborn, quiet kind. "I don't want to be a burden," he said. "Then stop arguing and let me check your bandages," Constance replied. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. She unwrapped the first wound carefully, and what she saw made her pause. The flesh around it was pink, not angry, not swollen, not the hot, red mess it had been that morning. It looked better. She frowned, but said nothing. Rewrapped it, moved to the second. Same thing, healing faster than it had any right to. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought, she told herself, not quite believing it. "Thank you," Brooks said, while she worked. For what you did. For not—" He stopped. His gaze dropped to the pups, still draped across him. "For not turning us out." Us. He was talking about the pups. Constance tied off the bandage and sat back, studying him. The way he spoke about them, the way his hand had drifted back to the larger pup without him seeming to notice. "They're very attached to you," she said carefully. Something softened in his face. "They are," he nodded. "How did you end up with them?" He looked at her for a long moment, longer than the question warranted. "They're mine," he said. Simply, like that was the whole answer. Before she could ask what he meant by that, the barn door banged open and Abby appeared, flushed and breathless, having clearly run from the cabin. "Mama, are you—" She stopped, saw Brooks, stared at him with open, unguarded curiosity. Brooks met her gaze and then, slowly, gave her a small nod. "Hello." Abby grinned, and then both pups woke up properly. It happened all at once, the larger one's head snapping up, ears perking, dark eyes finding Abby in the doorway. A small, eager sound, somewhere between a whine and a bark. The smaller one followed a beat later, lifting its face from Brooks's chest, spotting Abby, and letting out a noise that could only be described as delighted. They launched off Brooks like something had fired them, scrambling over each other in their haste, the larger one tumbling off his lap entirely and hitting the ground with a soft thump before righting itself and bounding toward Abby. The smaller one made it 2 steps before tripping over its own paws and face-planting into the straw. It got up, shook itself off, kept going. Abby dropped to her knees, laughing, and they hit her at the same time. The larger one pressing its whole body against her chest, tail wagging so hard its rear end swayed, the smaller one climbing into her lap and immediately beginning to lick her face with furious, sloppy enthusiasm. Oh, stop!" Abby was giggling so hard she could barely breathe, trying to gently push the smaller one's tongue away from her nose. It licked her chin instead. Constance looked at Brooks. Something in his face had gone very still, very soft. The hard edges, the wariness, the pride that wouldn't bend. All of it smoothed away, just for a moment, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. "One more night," he said, quietly, like it cost him something to say it. "Then we'll be gone. I swear it." Chapter 4. She found the pups first. Both of them were in the barn when she arrived the next morning, not with Brooks, for once, but sprawled on a patch of hay near the door, tangled up in each other in a way that suggested they'd fallen asleep mid-wrestle. The larger one had one paw draped across the smaller one's back. The smaller one had its face buried so deep in the hay that only its ears were visible. As Constance stepped inside, the larger pup's head came up. One eye opened. It regarded her for a long, drowsy moment, then yawned. "Good morning to you too," Constance murmured. The smaller one's ears twitched. That was all. She left them to it and crossed the barn to where Brooks was sitting against the wall. Properly sitting, she noticed. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She knelt beside him, setting down the water and the fresh cloth she'd brought. "Let's see how you're doing." When reached for the edge of his bandage, he moved like he aimed to stop her. But then, her fingers found his skin, and he stilled as she began to unwrap it. The first layer peeled away easily, dry, clean, stuck to nothing. She frowned and kept going. The second layer, the third. The cloth fell away in her hands, and she looked down at his chest, and her hands went still. The wound was gone. Smooth skin, warm and whole, where 3 days ago there had been 3 ragged holes and enough blood to fill a basin. Constance stared. She reached out, slowly, without thinking, and pressed her fingertips against the place where the first bullet had gone in. It was unmarked. There wasn't even a scar. She moved to the second spot, the third. Nothing. "This isn't possible," Constance said, looking up at Brooks. Brooks was watching her, carefully, waiting to see what she would do with what she was seeing. "And yet," he said. She didn't pull her hand away. It was still resting against his chest, against the smooth, warm skin where a wound had been, and beneath her palm she could feel his heartbeat, alive in a way that 3 bullet wounds should not have allowed. The warmth was there again, too. That same deep, pulsing heat she'd felt when she'd pulled the bullets out. She'd confused it with fever. But this was something else entirely. Something that seemed to travel up through her fingers and settle somewhere behind her ribs. Brooks's gaze dropped to where her fingers rested against his skin, then back up to her face. "You're staring," he said, the ghost of something that might have been amusement at the edges of his mouth. "You healed," she said. "You healed overnight, from 3 gunshot wounds." She stopped, swallowed. Her hand was still there, and she could feel the heat of him radiating against her palm. "People don't do that," she argued. He held her gaze. "No," he agreed. "They don't." The air between them had gone thick. Constance was aware of it the way you were aware of a storm coming in. Her heartbeat had quickened. "Move your hand," she told herself. "Get up. Go back to the cabin." She didn't move. Brooks's gaze dropped again, to her hand, to the place where her fingers rested against him. And this time, he didn't look away. Instead, his hand came up, slowly, and settled over hers. For one dizzying, breathless moment, the barn seemed to tilt sideways, and the only solid thing in the world was the press of his palm against the back of her hand. "What are you?" Constance asked softly. Brooks looked at her for a long moment. "Someone who was made for you," he said. She stared at him. He stared back, and there was nothing playful in his face now, nothing guarded. Just that raw, open, almost aching look. "That doesn't answer my question," she whispered. "No," he said. "I suppose not." And then he leaned in. It was slow. Slow enough that she could have stopped it. Slow enough that she saw it coming. Saw the way his eyes dropped to her mouth. Saw the slight lean of his body forward. She didn't stop him, and when his mouth found hers, the world went quiet. She leaned into him, into the warmth, into the pull that had been tugging at her since the moment she'd first pressed her hands against his wounds, and kissed him back. It was the kind of kiss that happened when something had been building for too long in too small a space, and the pressure had finally found an opening. His mouth was warm and firm, and when his thumb traced the line of her jaw, she made a sound she hadn't meant to make. The pup sneezed. Constance didn't notice. Neither did Brooks. The smaller one sneezed again, louder this time, a full-body shudder that sent it rolling sideways into a pile of hay. It blinked, dazed, and shook itself out with great dignity. Neither of them noticed that either. What broke the moment wasn't the pups. It was a voice. From outside, carried on the wind, rough and too loud and unmistakably familiar. "Constance, where the hell are you? Horse needs watering, and I'm..." Duke. Chapter 5. Duke Fletcher had never been a quiet man. He filled a room the way Smoke did. Not with presence exactly, but with occupation. Loud, sprawling, taking up more space than he'd earned. Constance heard him before she saw him. The thump of boots on the porch, the creak of the door thrown open without ceremony, the particular brand of cheerfulness that meant he'd been drinking since before noon. "Constance, there you are." He was already in the cabin when she turned, shrugging off his coat with exaggerated care. His face was ruddy, his eyes bright in that unfocused way that meant the whiskey had done its work. "Miss me?" he asked. "You're back early," she said, carefully neutral. "The way you spoke to a dog you weren't sure about. Cards went bad." He waved a hand, dismissive. "Doesn't matter. I'm home now." He looked around the cabin, at the table, the fire, the general state of things, and his lip curled. "Hell, Constance, have you even tried to keep this place up while I was gone?" She didn't rise to it. She'd learned a long time ago that rising to it only made it worse. "I've been managing," she shrugged. "Barely." He dropped into a chair, Duke's chair, the one at the head of the table, and stretched his legs out in front of him. His gaze drifted over her, slow and appraising. "You look tired," he said. Then softer, with a smile that was meant to be charming. "Come here. Sit with me." The way he said it, the "come here," as though she were something he could summon. Constance's stomach tightened. "I need to check on Abby," she said. "Abby can wait." He reached out and caught her wrist. I've been gone 2 weeks. Don't you want to? Duke, she extracted her wrist. You're drunk. I'm relaxed. He let her go, but the smile turned sour at the edges. You know, I met a woman named Helena. Lovely thing. Didn't complain when a man wanted company. He said it casually. The way you mentioned the weather. Constance felt nothing. Or rather, she felt the nothing very precisely, like pressing a bruise and finding it numb. How nice for you, she said. Duke's smile flickered. He didn't like being dismissed. Don't be like that, he said, standing. I provide for this family. The least you could do is... Constance glanced toward the window. Brooks was there, on the other side of the glass, half turned toward the door like he'd been moving fast and had just stopped himself. He must have heard. He was close enough that she could see his face clearly. Their eyes met. His were gold. Unnaturally gold, burning, furious, bright and wild and fixed on Duke. Constance gave a shake of her head. No, stay back. Keep hidden. Something in Brooks's face tightened. For a long, terrible moment she thought he was going to come through that door anyway. Damn her wishes. Damn the consequences. He didn't. But he didn't step back from the window either. I'm here, his stillness said. I'm right here. Constance tore her gaze away before Duke could notice where she was looking. The least you could do, Duke was saying, is act like a wife when I'm actually... Papa? Abby's voice, from the doorway to the back room. Small, uncertain. Duke turned and sighed. Go back to your room, Abby, he said. Abby didn't move. She was standing very still, one hand on the doorframe. Behind her, 2 small, dark shapes pressed close together in the shadows of the hallway. I want to stay, Abby said. Her chin lifted, just a fraction, but enough. Duke's face changed. The charm dropped away like a mask slipping, and what was underneath was ugly. Small and petty and too drunk to bother hiding it. Hell, child, do as you're told, he began, taking a step towards her. A growl interrupted, coming from somewhere near Abby's feet. The larger pup had its hackles up, a ridge of dark fur standing stiff along its spin. The smaller one was beside it, vibrating with attention. Duke looked down at them, blinked. What the... The larger pup barked, sharp, loud. The smaller one snarled again and took a step forward. Something flickered across Duke's face. Not fear, exactly. Irritation. Shut up, he said, and grabbed the smaller pup by the scruff. The sound it made was terrible. A thin, strangled yelp, high and desperate and wrong. And Abby cried out, lurching forward. But Duke had already lifted the pup to chest height, dangling it with one hand, squeezing just enough to make it squirm. Mangy little, he began. The cabin door blew open. It swung wide and slammed against the wall, and Brooks filled the doorway. Shirtless, and his hair was wild, like he'd been pacing, like he'd been waiting. His chest was bare and smooth where the wounds had been, and every line of his body was taut, coiled. His eyes were gold. Not even the burning gold from the window. This was something else. Something raw and barely leashed that made Duke take an involuntary step back before he caught himself. Put him down, Brooks said. Duke stared at him. For one long, suspended second, something like self-preservation flickered behind his eyes. Some animal part of him that recognized, even through the whiskey, that the thing in the doorway was not something to argue with. It wasn't enough. Who the hell are you? Duke demanded. His grip on the pup tightened, and Constance saw his knuckles go white. Brooks took one step into the cabin. The air in the room seemed to change, thickened, charged, like the moment before lightning struck. I said, Brooks repeated very quietly, put my kid down. Duke opened his mouth to argue, but Brooks crossed the room in 2 strides and took the pup from his hand. His fingers closed around Duke's wrist and moved it, and Duke's grip broke like it was nothing, like his hand was made of paper. The pup dropped into Brooks's other arm, pressed immediately against his chest, and went silent. And then Brooks pushed Duke out of the cabin. A single shove, just a hand flat against Duke's sternum. But he went flying across the cabin, through the still open door, off the porch, and into the mud of the yard with a wet, graceless thud. The silence that followed was absolute. Sleep it off in the barn, Brooks said, not a suggestion. Duke lay in the mud for a long moment. Then he lifted his head, spat, and looked up at Brooks, who stood in the doorway. Slowly, wiping the mud from his hands, he walked to the barn without another word. Chapter 6. Brooks was pacing. Back and forth across the cabin, the smaller pup still held against his chest. His eyes were still gold, and she couldn't stop looking at him. That was the thing she couldn't explain. The thing that had been building since the barn, since the kiss that had tasted like something she'd been hungry for without knowing it. She wanted to touch him. She wanted it so badly her fingers ached with it. It was need, blunt and insistent and impossible to ignore. She folded her arms across her chest. "Brooks," she murmured. Abby appeared at Brooks's side then. She just reached up and touched the smaller pup where it was pressed against Brooks's chest. It let out a thin, exhausted whine. "Come on," Abby said softly. "Both of you. Let's go." Brooks loosened his grip, the smaller pup sliding from his arms into Abby's. The larger one, still at his feet, followed without hesitation as she took them both to the back room. "Brooks," Constance then insisted when he started pacing again. He stopped, turned, and the look in his face. Oh gosh. She'd seen him gentle. She'd seen him quiet and guarded and careful. This was none of those things. "He touched them," Brooks said. His voice was rough, almost a growl. "He put his hands on my—" "The pup is fine," Constance said, keeping her voice steady. "Brooks, it was awful and I'm sorry, but—" "They're not pups," Brooks snapped. The words came out hard, flat. "What?" Constance blinked. Brooks looked at her. The gold in his eyes was still burning. "They're not pups," he said again, quieter this time. "They're my children." The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. Constance stared at him. "Brooks," she said carefully. "They're wolves." Exhausted frustration crossed his features, like he'd been carrying a weight for too long. "I know what they look like," he said. He nodded toward the back room where Abby had gone. "Go, check on them, and then come back and tell me what you see." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned her gaze on the back room and she heard them before she saw them. Crying. Small, hiccuping, frightened crying. The kind that came from throats that didn't know how to cry yet, that were too new at it. 2 voices, both very, very young. Constance gasped and pushed the door open. Abby was on the floor, her back against the bed, her arms full with 2 children. Small boys, toddlers, barely 3, naked and shivering and real, were pressed against her daughter's chest, one on each side. They were crying, both of them. Tears and snot and hitching little breaths, their tiny fingers twisted into Abby's clothes with a desperate, clinging grip. Abby looked up at Constance. Her face was white. "They changed," she whispered. "Mama, they changed." Her voice wobbled. She looked down at the boys, at the way they were shaking against her. "They're so scared, Mama," she murmured sadly. Constance didn't move for one long, breathless second. Then she was on the floor. She crossed the small room in 2 steps and dropped to her knees in front of Abby, and the boys, sensing her maybe, lifted their faces from Abby's chest and looked at her. 2 pairs of dark eyes, wet, terrified. "Oh," Constance breathed. "Oh, sweethearts, both of you, come here." She opened her arms. The smaller one went first, peeled himself away from Abby and stumbled forward, and Constance caught him against her chest. He pressed his face into her neck and let out a sound. Not a word, not yet, just a raw, broken exhale of relief. The larger one followed a beat later. He tucked himself against his brother, pressed his cheek against Constance's collarbone, and went very still. Constance held them both. "It's all right," she murmured. "I've got you." The smaller one's breathing slowed by degrees. The larger one hadn't moved, just pressed closer, a small, warm, solid weight against her chest. They were children. "My kids," Brooks had said in the barn, half dead and barely conscious. Constance closed her eyes. When she opened them, Brooks was in the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, one shoulder, one hand braced against the wood, and he was watching her hold his sons. "Let's put them down," Constance said, quietly, to Brooks, to the room. He nodded and pushed off the doorframe and came to help her. Abby watched too from the floor, her chin resting on her knees. "Are they going to be all right?" she asked. "Yes," Brooks said, simply, and then softer. "Thank you for holding them." Abby nodded, serious and solemn. "I won't tell anyone," Abby said, with the gravity of someone making a sacred vow. Brooks smiled. A real one, small and quiet and a little bit sad. "I know, sweetheart." Constance shepherded Abby to her own bed. When she came back to the main room, Brooks was standing by the fire, staring into it. The flames threw sharp shadows across his face. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like he might come apart at the seams. Was he feeling what she'd been feeling all evening? That low, insistent throb behind her ribs, like a second heartbeat trying to sync with hers. The cabin was quiet now. The boys were asleep. Duke was gone, and there was nothing left to hide behind. Brooks was across the room and she wanted to cross it. It was as simple as that. And yet, there was nothing simple about it. Because her husband was home. And Brooks' children were boys, but they were also wolves. She dug her nails into the wood of the door behind her and held still. "Talk to me," she said. He didn't turn around. Not right away. He stood with his back to her, one hand braced on the mantel. "You know what I am," he said, not a question. "I know something is different about you," Constance replied. "The healing, the eyes, the strength." A pause. "The boys." He turned then, slowly. And when he faced her, the careful composure she'd seen him wear like armor was gone. And what was underneath was hungry, barely leashed and burning with it, his eyes gold again. "I'm a shifter," he said. "Wolf. I shift. So do they." A glance toward the back room. "It's what we are." Constance took that in, slowly. "And the boys," she said. "They really are your children." "Yes," Brooks said. "And when you said—" She stopped, swallowed. Her mouth had gone dry. The pull was stronger now, almost painful, a heat low in her chest that spread outward every time he looked at her. "When you said you were made for me," she blushed but went on. "In the barn before. What did you mean by that?" Brooks looked at her, and the pretense dropped out of him entirely. He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopped just short of her, his pupils blown wide, the gold of his irises almost swallowed by it. Her body was screaming at her to close the last few inches between them. She didn't. She pressed back against the door and held his gaze and waited. "I meant exactly what I said," he confessed, and his voice had dropped so low it was barely a sound. "It meant that every part of me has been pulling toward you since the moment you touched me. That I have been fighting it, every hour, because you are not mine to take." His hand came up, stopped itself, mid-air, fingers curling. "And yet, you are. You are mine. My mate." He paused. "Which means I can't stop." The confession hung between them, raw and wrecked. Constance's heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her own ears. The pull was unbearable now, a current running through her, hot and bright and insistent. "I'm a married woman," she stammered. Brooks's jaw tightened. Something flickered in his expression. Pain, maybe, or fury, or both. And when he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything except the truth of it. "Duke Fletcher," he said, "does not deserve you. He doesn't see you." His hand rose again, and this time he didn't stop it. "Meanwhile, I have seen nothing else since the moment you put your hands on my wounds and chose not to let me die," he said. "Brooks," Constance whispered. His fingers brushed her jaw. "You are mine," he said. He said it like it was the only true thing left in the world. Like everything else, the law, the marriage, the danger, was just noise. And the terrible thing, the thing that made her chest crack open, was that something inside her answered. It answered, and it said yes. She closed the distance herself, 1 step, just one. and grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him down to her. The kiss was nothing like before. This was not slow or careful or two people giving in at the same time. This was Brooks's mouth on hers like he'd been drowning and she was air. His arm locked around her waist and hauled her flush against him, and the press of his body against hers, warm, solid, real, drew a sound out of her that she didn't recognize. His hand slid into her hair and she gasped against his mouth, and he swallowed the sound, and the kiss went deeper, hungrier, wilder, like a dam breaking. "Brooks," she whispered. Her voice was wrecked. She didn't care. "Isaiah, the sheriff. He's Duke's brother. And Duke will talk, you know he will. If Isaiah comes here..." Brooks shushed her. "I know," he said. His thumb moved against her scalp, shaking. His mouth moved to her jaw, her neck. His teeth grazed the skin just below her ear, and her knees went weak and his arm tightened. "You have to leave," she gasped. "Tonight, before..." He opened his eyes, gold still, bright and desperate and aching. "One night," he said, rough, barely a whisper. "Give me one night. Let me..." He stopped, swallowed. His hand tightened just slightly in her hair. "I will be gone by morning. But give me this, please." Constance looked at him, at his face, open and raw and wanting her so badly it was written in every line of him. She thought about Duke, sleeping it off in her barn, about everything that was coming, and how little time they had before it arrived. "One night," she said. Something in Brooks's face broke. He kissed her again, softer this time, but no less desperate. And she let him, and let herself sink into it, and stopped pretending it was anything other than what it had been since she'd first touched him. Inevitable. Chapter 7. Constance woke to warmth. Brooks's arm was around her waist, heavy and solid, his breath slow and even against the back of her neck. She lay still for a moment, just a moment, and let herself have it. The quiet, the warmth, the steady press of him against her, like he'd been holding on all night and hadn't let go. His thumb moved once, against her hip. Asleep, maybe. Or not. She closed her eyes, memorized the feeling. Then she untangled herself, carefully, and went to make breakfast. The cabin was quiet in the way mornings were quiet. Soft light, the creak of the fire settling, Abby still asleep in the back room with the boys. Constance moved through it on instinct, hands busy. Water on for coffee, cornmeal into the pot, the rhythm of it familiar and grounding. Brooks stirred somewhere behind her. She heard him sit up, heard the quiet rustle of him pulling on his shirt. She glanced toward the barn door without thinking about it, and stopped. A horse, on the road. One rider, coming fast, dust rising behind him in the still morning air. Isaiah. Constance's hands went still on the pot. She watched him for 1 second, 2, and in that same second, the pieces fell into place, fast and cold and obvious. Duke's side of the barn, empty this morning. The boot prints in the mud she'd noticed on her way out for water. The road to Clearwater, half a mile away. Duke had woken up. Duke had gone to his brother. Of course he had. She set the pot down, turned. Brooks was already on his feet, the boys pressed against his legs, one on each side, holding fistfuls of his shirt, their small faces turned up toward his with a trust so complete it made her chest ache. They knew something was wrong. Children always did. "Stay behind me," Brooks said to the boys, quietly, firmly, the way he'd spoken to them in the barn, in the dark, when they were wolves and frightened. "Right there. I've got you." The larger boy nodded, solemn. The smaller one pressed closer to his leg and said nothing, but his grip tightened. Abby appeared from the back room, already dressed, her hair pulled back. She looked at Constance, then at Brooks, then at the boys. She understood, or understood enough. Her face set in a way that made her look much older than 6. "Stay with them," Constance told her. "Behind Brooks. Don't move." Abby nodded. The knock at the door was sharp, official. The kind of knock that didn't wait for an answer. Constance opened it. Isaiah Fletcher filled the doorway. Up close, he looked tired, more tired than she'd seen him in years. The lines around his mouth were deeper than she remembered. His eyes moved past her, into the cabin, scanning, and she watched him find Brooks and the boys and Abby, all in one sweep, and she watched something shift behind his expression. Something complicated. "Constance," he said, flat, "step aside." "Isaiah." "I know he's in there." His gaze hadn't left Brooks. "Duke told me what happened, what he is." "Duke told you what Duke wanted you to hear," Constance said. She didn't move from the doorway. "Which is not the same thing." Something flickered in Isaiah's expression. Irritation, maybe, or the faintest edge of uncertainty. He wasn't used to being challenged. Not by her. "Move, Constance." "No." The word hung in the air. Isaiah's jaw tightened. He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't in years. And for one brief moment, something almost human moved behind his eyes. Then he pushed past her. He saw Brooks first, the man standing in the middle of the cabin, bare-armed, steady on his feet. The gold eyes. Isaiah's gaze snagged on them and stayed, and Constance watched something cold settle into his expression. Recognition. Confirmation. This was what Duke had described. This was the thing. His rifle came up. "Don't," Brooks said. One word. Quiet. Utterly calm. Isaiah's finger found the trigger. The two of them faced each other across the small cabin, the sheriff and the shifter, the rifle and the gold eyes, and the air between them was so tight Constance could feel it pressing against her skin. "You're coming with me," Isaiah said. "Isaiah," Constance's voice sharp. "Look." She didn't point. She didn't need to. Isaiah looked. It took him a moment. His eyes moved past Brooks, past the man, past the threat, past everything he'd come here expecting to find, and landed on what was behind him. Two small boys, dressed in clothes too big for them, standing close together, one slightly in front of the other. The larger one had his chin up, defiant, even now, even here, with a rifle in the room. But his small hand was pressed flat against his brother's back, steady and protective. The smaller one was half hidden behind him, one dark eye visible, watching Isaiah with an expression of such quiet, unblinking fear that it stopped the breath in Constance's chest all over again. And in front of them, between the boys and the gun, stood Abby. She hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. She stood with her feet planted and her shoulders squared, and her small face set in an expression of such fierce, stubborn determination that Constance felt her heart crack clean in two. "You're not going to shoot them," Abby said. To Isaiah, to the rifle, to the whole room. Her voice didn't shake. Isaiah stared at her. The cabin was very quiet, just the four of them, 6, counting the boys, and the sound of the wind outside and the creak of the cabin settling on its foundation. No one else to look to, no one else to defer to. Just Isaiah and this. He was still looking at the boys, at the way they were pressed against Brooks, not hiding behind him, but with him, like he was the fixed point in a world that had come undone. At the way the smaller one had his face turned up toward Brooks, seeking reassurance without words, at the way the larger one's hand hadn't moved from his brother's back. At Abby, standing in front of them all, refusing to move. Something changed in Isaiah's face. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow. A gradual, almost painful shifting. Like a man watching something he'd been certain about rearrange itself in front of his eyes and having no choice but to watch it happen. No one else in the room to guide him. No deputies exchanging glances. No one to make the decision easier or share the weight of it. Just him. He lowered the rifle. Not all the way, not yet, but enough. "What is this?" he asked. And for the first time, his voice wasn't flat. It was something else. Something that sounded, underneath the authority and the habit of command, almost like confusion. Almost like a man who had come here expecting one thing and found another entirely. "This," Constance said, stepping forward, "is a man, with his children, and my daughter." She let that sit. Isaiah looked at her, then at Brooks, then at the boys again, Small, scared, dressed in clothes too big for them, holding each other up. "Duke said he was a monster," Isaiah said, quietly. "Duke says a lot of things," Constance said. "Have you ever noticed how few of them are true?" Something moved across Isaiah's face at that. Sharp and uncomfortable, the look of a man hearing something he'd been avoiding for a long time. He glanced toward the door, toward where Duke's horse was tied beside his own outside, and back. Constance watched him do it, watched him think about it, about Duke, about the man who had sent him here, to this cabin, to shoot a father in front of his children, his own brother. "He's your brother," she said, not pushing, just stating it. "And he sent you here to do his dirty work because that's what he does. He always has." Isaiah was quiet for a long time after that. He was still looking at Abby. Abby looked back at him. Steady, unwavering. Her small hand had drifted back, without her seeming to notice, until it rested against the larger boy's shoulder. The boy leaned into it, just slightly. "Please," Abby said, simply. "They're just kids." The word landed like a stone in still water. Isaiah closed his eyes. When he opened them, the sheriff's face was gone. Or not gone, exactly, but cracked. Something underneath showing through. Something older and tireder, and less certain than the man who had walked through the door. He looked at Brooks, at the gold eyes, still burning low and steady, at the way Brooks's hand had come to rest on the back of the smaller boy's head, gentle, automatic, the way you touched something you'd die for without thinking. He lowered the rifle the rest of the way, let it hang at his side. "How long?" Isaiah asked. Brooks held his gaze. "They're 3. Isaiah nodded, once, slowly. He turned to Constance. "Duke is outside," he said. His voice was flat again, but differently flat. Not the sheriff's flat, something heavier. "I'll deal with him." "Isaiah!" "I'll deal with him," he said again. And something in the way he said it, quiet, certain, with a weight behind it that Constance had never heard from him before, made her believe it. He looked at Brooks one last time. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not trust, not yet. But something. An acknowledgement, maybe. A line drawn. Then Isaiah Fletcher turned and walked out of the cabin and closed the door behind him. The quiet that followed was enormous. Brooks let out a breath. Long, shuddering, like he'd been holding it for hours. His hand was still on the back of the smaller boy's head. The boy had pressed his face against Brooks's hip and gone very still, the way he did when he was trying very hard to be brave and wasn't quite managing it. The larger one looked up at Brooks. "Papa?" The word, so small, so matter-of-fact, filled the cabin like sunlight. Brooks knelt, gathered them both against him, one arm around each, and pressed his face into the space between their heads, and held on. Constance watched from across the room. Abby had moved to her side, slipping her hand into her mother's, and was leaning against her hip with the easy, unconscious weight of a child who felt safe. Outside, she heard Isaiah's voice, sharp, low, directed at Duke. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. Brooks lifted his head, found her eyes across the room. The gold was fading, slowly, like a fire burning down, and underneath it was just brown and just a man, and just the way he looked at her when no one else was watching. Constance squeezed Abby's hand and held his gaze, and didn't look away. Epilogue. 6 months later. The morning started as mornings in Wolf Creek always did, with a crash. Constance looked up from the stove, where she was stirring porridge and trying very hard not to burn it, to find the source. The answer, as it usually was the 2 boys. One of them had climbed the chair again, standing on it triumphant, arms spread wide, and his brother was in the process of trying to pull him down by the hem of his shirt. "Nash," Constance said without turning around. "Off the chair." "I was already off the chair," Nash informed her from the floor, with a dignity that was somewhat undermined by the fact that his shirt was on backwards. The smaller one, Eli, was already climbing back up, eyeing the chair with a determination that suggested he was about to attempt the same feat his brother had just failed at. "Eli," Constance pointed the spoon at him. "Don't." Eli looked at the spoon, looked at the chair, looked at Constance. He sat down on the floor instead, next to Nash, and leaned against his brother's shoulder with an air of wounded innocence. "Sorry, Mama." Constance shook her head and went back to the porridge. Brooks found them like that when he came in from the yard. The boys on the floor, Abby at the table reading, the cabin warm and smelling of breakfast and wood smoke. "Morning," he said, and crossed the kitchen to press his lips to the top of her head as he passed. He crouched in front of the boys. "Did you climb the chair again?" he asked Nash. "No," Nash lied, without a flicker of guilt. Brooks looked at him, one eyebrow raised. Nash held for approximately 4 seconds before dissolving into a grin. "Maybe," he admitted. Brooks reached out and tugged Nash's shirt around the right way. "Eat your breakfast, both of you." The boys scrambled up, Eli first, Nash right behind, shoving his brother lightly as he went, and climbed into their seats. Constance set the bowls down in front of them and watched Eli immediately stick his finger in his porridge to test the temperature, while Nash stole a spoonful from his brother's bowl while Eli wasn't looking. "Papa," Eli said without looking up. "Nash is stealing." "Am not," Nash said, mouth full. Brooks sat down beside Constance, and she handed him his coffee, and for a moment they just sat there, side by side, watching their children eat breakfast. Wolf Creek was nothing like Clearwater. Small, yes, but warm in a way Clearwater never had been. People nodded when she passed. No one whispered. Because in Wolf Creek, everyone knew what Brooks was. Sheriff Wyatt Hayes, a shifter himself, mated to a human woman named Elizabeth, had made sure of that. Elizabeth had become a friend, the kind who showed up uninvited with bread and stayed for hours, who asked about Duke without flinching, who listened and didn't offer pity. Brooks had opened up too, in his own way. In pieces, late at night, always with Constance close enough to touch. His first wife, the birth that had gone wrong, the boys, the only bright thing left in the wreckage of it. They were healing, both of them. Slowly, unevenly, but together. That evening, the cabin was full of noise. Abby was at the table, reading aloud to the boys, the two leaning in, rapt. Nash had his elbows on the table and his chin in his hands. Eli had curled into a ball against Abby's side. Brooks was by the fire, whittling something. A small wooden figure, Constance realized. Toys for the children. Constance leaned in the doorway and watched them. How the firelight moved across Brooks's face, the way his mouth twitched when Abby did one of the voices wrong. The boys, small and warm and alive, tucked against their sister. Brooks looked up, caught her watching, smiled, small and private, and just for her. Outside, the first stars were appearing. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Not loneliness, just a voice, calling out into the dark, saying, "I'm here. I'm home." Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this story. I was genuinely happy to step back into this Western world, one I hadn't visited in a while, and to reconnect with the atmosphere I first explored with Elizabeth and Wyatt. If you haven't listened to that story yet, or if you'd like to revisit it, you can find the link in the description. As always, I'd love to know what you thought. So, don't hesitate to leave a comment. Sending you love, Lily.